Willow Creek was the kind of town people passed through without a second glance. Nestled in the rolling hills of rural Virginia, its charm lay in its simplicity. A main street with mom-and-pop shops, a single diner that served as the town's heartbeat, and neighbors who knew each other by name. Nothing much happened here, and that's how the locals liked it. The Barnes family had lived at the edge of town for generations. Their modest farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, tucked between dense woods and a lazy stream. Richard Barnes, the latest in the line of men to carry on the family name, had remarried after his first wife died in a car accident 5 years prior. His new wife, Nancy, was a stern woman, nothing like the warm and kind-hearted Susan who had passed. Richard's only daughter, Lily, was just 12 when her mother died. Now 17, she had grown into a quiet, introverted girl who spent most of her time in the woods behind their home or sketching in her notebooks. The townspeople always noted that Lily had her mother's gentle eyes and kind smile, but Nancy never liked to be reminded of Susan. The life at the Barnes home had grown colder over the years. Tensions simmered under the surface, unnoticed by the neighbors. Nancy, once a teacher in a nearby town, had become increasingly strict with Lily. Richard, occupied with running the family's small lumber business, seemed oblivious to the growing rift between his new wife and daughter. But that autumn, something snapped, and the peace that had always seemed so unshakable in Willow Creek was shattered forever. On a crisp October morning, the town awoke to an eerie silence, broken only by the distant wail of sirens. The hollow sound of the police car echoed through the quiet streets as the townsfolk emerged from their homes, whispering and exchanging worried glances. Nothing ever happened in Willow Creek, but the flashing lights made it clear something terrible had. Sheriff Grady pulled up to the Barnes farmhouse after a frantic call came in. It was Richard Barnes, his voice shaking, saying Lily was missing. A search party was quickly assembled, made up of neighbors and deputies who knew the woods around Willow Creek like the backs of their hands. But as they ventured into the thick trees, the atmosphere grew heavy with an unspoken fear. By noon, the group reached a small clearing by the stream, a place Lily had always favored. It was there, beneath a canopy of dying autumn leaves, that they found her. Lily's body lay motionless, half submerged in the shallow water. Her once bright eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky above, while her pale skin seemed to blend with the mist hanging low over the water. The initial shock gave way to a grim realization. This wasn't an accident. Her throat was bruised, marked with signs of strangulation. There were no signs of a struggle nearby, no obvious clues pointing to who had done this. The only thing they knew was that whoever took Lily's life had done so with a sickening deliberation. As the sheriff stood over the scene, the gravity of what had just been discovered began to sink in. For a town like Willow Creek, this was unthinkable. But what the town didn't know yet was that the killer was much closer to home than they could have ever imagined. The one who had stolen Lily's life wasn't some drifter passing through or a stranger lurking in the woods. It was someone inside the farmhouse, someone who had known Lily her entire life. The murder of Lily Barnes was only the beginning, and the truth behind it would reveal the darkest shadows hiding in Willow Creek's quietest corners. The aftermath of Lily's death sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. News spread quickly, and soon every whispered conversation at the diner, every passing glance at the grocery store, centered around the same question: who could have done such a thing? The police were investigating, but answers seemed scarce. Back at the Barnes farmhouse, the air was thick with grief. Richard Barnes, once a stoic figure, was reduced to a hollow shell of a man. His hands trembled as he stared at the empty chair where Lily used to sit. He couldn't fathom how his little girl had been taken from him so violently. Nancy, on the other hand, was strikingly composed. She moved through the house with a chilling sense of order, tending to small tasks as if nothing had changed. To the outside world, Nancy appeared to be a grieving stepmother, her face carefully arranged into an expression of somber sadness. But behind closed doors, there was something unsettling about her demeanor. Her eyes, cold and distant, betrayed no emotion when Richard wasn't looking. There were no tears, no signs of sorrow, just a quiet, almost calculating presence. It didn't take long for the sheriff to grow suspicious. He had been to the Barnes home several times since Lily's body was found, each time noting the strange dynamic between Richard and Nancy. While Richard seemed to be spiraling, Nancy maintained an eerie calm. She spoke in clipped sentences, answering questions without elaboration, and seemed unnerved by the scrutiny. The investigation dragged on, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no clues left behind in the woods. Days turned into weeks, and the townspeople began to grow restless. Whispers of suspicion circled around Richard, fueled by rumors of old debts and trouble at the lumber mill. But beneath it all, the sheriff's gut told him something was off about Nancy. And soon, the pieces of the puzzle would begin to fall into place. As the investigation continued, A darker story began to emerge from the shadows. The sheriff interviewed neighbors, former friends, and anyone who had been close to the Barnes family. The portrait they painted of life inside that farmhouse was far from idyllic. Nancy's behavior towards Lily had been a topic of quiet concern among some of the townsfolk. A former colleague of Nancy's from her teaching days mentioned how she would often complain about Lily, referring to her stepdaughter in harsh, unforgiving terms. Nancy had been known for her strictness in the classroom, but it seemed her harshness had bled into her personal life. She never spoke fondly of Lily, and over the years the distance between them had only grown. Several neighbors recalled overhearing arguments coming from the house. Nancy's voice, raised in anger, would echo across the quiet evenings, while Lily's responses were barely audible, but no one had ever thought much of it. People in small towns tended to mind their own business. The sheriff's suspicions deepened when he discovered that Richard had recently changed his will, leaving the bulk of his modest estate to Lily. Nancy had never been mentioned in it. It wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest, but it added to the growing list of red flags. Then came the autopsy report. It revealed something chilling. The marks on Lily's neck were made by someone with small hands, likely a woman. The injuries were methodical, not the result of a violent struggle, but of cold, calculated force. The sheriff knew, deep down, that Nancy was no grieving mother. She was something far more sinister. As the investigation tightened around Nancy, her cold exterior began to crack. The sheriff noticed subtle changes. Her carefully controlled expressions faltered, and she grew more defensive when questioned. Richard, oblivious to his wife's growing unease, continued to grieve, trusting Nancy to handle the household while he tried to piece together his shattered world. But Nancy's secret was unraveling faster than she could control. The truth about what had happened that night in the woods was creeping closer to the surface, and soon she would no longer be able to hide behind her mask of calm indifference. The sheriff had been meticulous in his search for evidence, yet so far, every thread led him back to the same conclusion. Nancy was hiding something. Her demeanor had shifted subtly as the investigation closed in on her. What had once been calm composure now felt more like quiet panic. She no longer moved through the house with the same cold grace, and her eyes darted nervously when she spoke. It wasn't until a forensic team returned to the woods, retracing the steps that led to Lily's body, that they made a breakthrough. A piece of fabric torn and snagged on a branch was found near the stream, not far from where Lily had been discovered. It was small, almost insignificant, but unmistakably part of a woman's blouse. The fabric matched a shirt Nancy had been seen wearing in the days leading up to Lily's disappearance. The discovery pushed the sheriff to act. He brought Nancy in for further questioning. As he laid the fabric before her on the interrogation table, her calm demeanor shattered for the first time. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she stared at the cloth, the weight of the moment sinking in. The sheriff watched her carefully, knowing that he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But Nancy refused to crack. She denied everything, stating she hadn't been in the woods that day, and that the fabric must have come from something long discarded. Her denials were mechanical, and her coldness returned as she recited rehearsed answers, trying to deflect suspicion. Still, the sheriff felt it. Something was there, buried deep beneath the surface of Nancy's lies. He just needed one more piece to break her carefully constructed facade. And that piece would come soon enough, from an unexpected source. Richard Barnes had been drowning in grief, too numb to see what was happening around him. For weeks, he had relied on Nancy to keep him afloat, allowing her to handle the daily tasks while he mourned the loss of his daughter. But as days passed, something began to gnaw at him, a quiet suspicion that had taken root and grown in the dark corners of his mind. They started with small things, moments of unease that Richard couldn't shake. He recalled Nancy's sharpness with Lily in the months before her death, the arguments that seemed to flare up more frequently. He remembered how Nancy had grown more distant from him, how she had seemed annoyed by Lily's presence in the house. And then there were the strange, whispered conversations she had late at night, when she thought Richard was asleep. He began to piece together fragments of memories, things he had ignored or dismissed. He had trusted Nancy, believed that her strictness with Lily was simply her way of trying to raise a teenager in difficult circumstances. But now, with his daughter gone and the fabric found in the woods, a dark realization began to take shape. Richard started spending more time away from the house, driving aimlessly through the town or sitting at the diner for hours. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Nancy had something to do with Lily's death. He couldn't confront her, he wasn't ready for that yet. But his trust in her had been shattered, replaced by a growing sense of dread. One evening, after driving aimlessly through Willow Creek, Richard returned home to find Nancy sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands tightly gripping a glass of wine. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Richard barely spoke to her, his mind racing with the realization that the woman he had married might have taken his daughter's life. In the coming days, Richard made a quiet decision. He would visit the sheriff, share his suspicions, and tell the truth about what he knew. It pained him to even think it. The evidence was too overwhelming. He needed to confront the possibility that Nancy was not who she seemed. As Richard drove toward the sheriff's office that evening, the weight of the truth hung over him like a storm cloud. He couldn't escape the thought that his love for Nancy had blinded him to the evil that had taken root in their home. And once the sheriff heard what he had to say, Richard knew there would be no turning back. Richard sat in the sheriff's office, his hands resting heavily on his knees, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. The sheriff leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as Richard hesitated, searching for the right words. It was the hardest conversation he'd ever had. Admitting to himself that Nancy was involved in Lily's death had been a slow, agonizing process, but now he was about to lay everything bare. He told the sheriff about the arguments between Nancy and Lily, how Nancy's temper had flared more often in recent months. He spoke of the distant look in Nancy's eyes after Lily's death, how she had remained disturbingly composed when most mothers would have been inconsolable. Then, there were the nights Richard had overheard Nancy on the phone, her voice hushed but sharp, as if she were planning something or speaking to someone she didn't want Richard to know about. The sheriff listened in silence, his suspicion toward Nancy growing with every word. When Richard spoke of the torn fabric found in the woods, a heavy pause followed. The sheriff asked Richard if Nancy had ever been violent, and though Richard hesitated, he admitted that her strictness toward Lily had bordered on cruelty in the past. His voice faltered as he recalled the way Nancy would glare at Lily, as though she were a constant reminder of something she couldn't stand. With Richard's confession, the sheriff knew he had enough to push harder. He thanked Richard for coming forward, promising they would follow every lead. But as Richard left the office, his heart sank. He knew the truth was out now, but the reality of it felt heavier than ever. He had brought the woman who might have murdered his daughter into their home, and he hadn't seen it coming. That night, as Richard drove back to the farmhouse, the trees seemed to close in around the narrow road. The dark woods whispered with secrets, and the hollow ache in his chest deepened. He couldn't face Nancy yet, not without knowing how much she had hidden from him. The answers were coming, but they wouldn't come quietly. Nancy sensed a shift in the air. Richard had grown more distant over the past few days, and his eyes held a suspicion that hadn't been there before. She knew he had gone to the sheriff, though he hadn't said anything. Her control over the situation, once so carefully maintained, was slipping. She could feel it in the way people spoke to her now, their words edged with doubt, their eyes questioning. The sheriff's frequent visits to the house had unnerved her. He had come by again after Richard's confession, asking pointed questions, digging deeper into her past, her relationship with Lily, her alibis. Nancy remained stoic under the scrutiny, but inside she was seething. She had spent years building her life with Richard, molding herself into the respectable wife, stepping into the shoes of a woman she had never admired. But Lily had been a constant reminder of that past, a ghost of Richard's first wife, always hovering between them. Nancy had tried to control Lily, to bend her to her will, but the girl had resisted at every turn. She had seen Lily's kindness as a weakness, a quality that reminded Richard too much of his late wife. As Lily grew older, her quiet defiance only deepened Nancy's resentment. The night of Lily's death had not been planned, not in the beginning, at least. But the argument that had erupted between them in the woods had escalated quickly. Nancy had followed Lily out there, intending only to confront her about something trivial, but the words between them had turned venomous. And in that moment, something dark had risen in Nancy, something she could no longer control. She remembered the look in Lily's eyes as her hands tightened around the girl's throat, the brief struggle, and then the terrible stillness. Now, with the sheriff closing in, Nancy knew her time was running out. She had underestimated Richard's resolve, thinking his grief would blind him to her actions forever. But the sheriff's investigation was relentless, and Nancy felt the walls of the farmhouse closing in on her. She had come too far to let it all crumble now. But the more she tried to maintain her composure, the more cracks appeared. Late one evening, when Richard was out of the house again, Nancy paced the dimly lit kitchen. Her mind raced, plotting her next move. She couldn't let the truth come to light, not after all the effort she had put into burying it. But with every passing hour, the noose around her neck tightened. Nancy knew she had to act soon, before the sheriff uncovered the final piece of evidence that would seal her fate. But deep down, she also knew that the truth had a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply it had been buried. And once it did, there would be no escaping the consequences of what she had done. The following days saw the tension at the Barnes household spiral into a suffocating, silent war. Richard, armed with his suspicions, barely spoke to Nancy. The house, once full of tension between Nancy and Lily, now held a different kind of uneasy, quiet, watchful presence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Nancy, in her desperation, tried to maintain her grip on Richard. She would sit at the kitchen table with him, offering hollow words of comfort that felt out of place, as though rehearsed. But Richard no longer looked at her with the same trust. His eyes, once warm and full of faith, were clouded with doubt, and behind that doubt, a flicker of rage simmered. The sheriff's visits had grown more frequent. He began to interview townspeople again, digging into Nancy's past and peeling away the layers she had tried so hard to cover. Her story began to unravel, slowly at first, like a loose thread tugged free from an old garment. The sheriff discovered that Nancy had a history of aggression, small, easily overlooked incidents during her time as a teacher, students who had felt her sharp temper, parents who had raised concerns but never followed through. She had always managed to keep her mask intact, but now, those cracks were beginning to show. It wasn't long before a new piece of evidence surfaced, a witness. A local teenage boy who often went hunting in the woods had seen something the night Lily disappeared. He hadn't come forward before, too scared to get involved. But with the town buzzing and rumors swirling, his guilt over keeping silent became too much to bear. He told the sheriff he had seen Nancy walking into the woods behind Lily that evening, her movements stiff and deliberate, as if she were following the girl with purpose. With the witness testimony, the torn fabric, and Richard's confession, the sheriff knew it was time to act. He returned to the Barnes farmhouse with a warrant, ready to search the property and finally confront Nancy with the evidence against her. When the sheriff arrived, Richard stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He had been expecting this moment, though it didn't make it any easier. Inside, Nancy sat at the kitchen table, her eyes hollow and her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass. She didn't look up when the sheriff entered, didn't react to the sight of officers walking through her home. She had known this day would come, and now that it had arrived, there was nothing left to fight for. The sheriff approached Nancy slowly, laying the witness statement, the fabric, and all the evidence before her. He explained that they had reason to believe she had followed Lily into the woods that night with intent. Nancy sat silently, her eyes never leaving the glass in her hands. But when the sheriff mentioned Lily's name, something flickered in Nancy's expression, a brief flash of emotion, quickly suppressed. She had kept her composure for so long, but now, with nowhere left to hide, the weight of it all seemed to press down on her. For the first time since Lily's death, Nancy spoke. Her voice was cold, mechanical, and distant as she recounted the events of that night. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. She spoke of Lily like a problem that had been dealt with, a shadow she had finally erased. To her mind, she had done what she thought was necessary. Lily had been a constant reminder of Susan, of the life Richard had lived before her, and Nancy could no longer stand the sight of her. As Nancy finished speaking, Richard, who had been standing quietly by, could barely hold himself together, his face crumpled in disbelief and horror. The woman he had loved, trusted, and invited into his life had taken his daughter from him in the most brutal way imaginable. His world had been shattered again, but this time by the person he had brought closest to his heart. Nancy was arrested that evening, her calm, calculated demeanor never wavering as the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. The townspeople gathered outside the house, watching in stunned silence as the sheriff led her to the car. For Willow Creek, a town that had always prided itself on its simplicity and innocence, the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface was now exposed for all to see. In the weeks that followed Nancy's arrest, the small town of Willow Creek struggled to process the horrors that had unfolded in their quiet corner of the world. The headlines screamed about the stepmother killer, and reporters swarmed the town, searching for the salacious details of the tragedy that had forever marred its idyllic reputation. Nancy, facing a trial for first-degree murder, showed little remorse during the proceedings. She sat in the courtroom, her face expressionless, as the evidence was laid out against her. The jury heard how she had strangled Lily in a fit of jealous rage, consumed by the resentment she had harbored for years. Her cold, calculated actions left no doubt in their minds, and the verdict came swiftly guilty. Richard, a broken man, didn't attend the trial after the first day. He couldn't bear to hear the details, to relive the horror of losing Lily and discovering the truth about Nancy. He withdrew from the community, selling the farmhouse and moving to a small, rented apartment on the other side of the county. The townspeople, once so familiar with his quiet strength, now whispered about the hollow man he had become, his spirit crushed under the weight of his losses. The farmhouse at the edge of Willow Creek stood empty for months after the sale, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had taken place there. The woods behind it, once a peaceful retreat for Lily, were now tainted by the memory of her death. The stream where her body had been found forever stained in the minds of the townspeople. In the years that followed, Willow Creek slowly returned to its quiet routine, but it was never the same. The Barnes family tragedy left an indelible mark on the town, a shadow that lingered in the air. The gossip faded, the reporters left, but the memory of what had happened remained etched in the hearts of those who had known Lily. And Richard Barnes, alone in his small apartment miles away, would live out his days haunted by the loss of his daughter and the betrayal of the woman he had once loved. Every autumn, as the leaves began to fall, he would think of Lily, the daughter he had failed to protect, and of the woods where she had lost her life, the place where innocence had been taken by the cold, calculated hands of her stepmother. The Willow Creek would never forget. After Nancy's conviction, the farmhouse at the edge of Willow Creek became a symbol of loss and betrayal. Once a place of routine and family life, it now stood abandoned, its windows dark, the yard overgrown with weeds. The locals stopped walking past it. Some even crossed the street to avoid the sight of the weathered structure, where tragedy had cast a long shadow. No one wanted to buy the house. The property, with its rich history tied to the Barnes family, had become infamous. Real estate agents tried to distance the listing from the events that had occurred there, but no one in Willow Creek could forget. The stream where Lily's body was found had turned into an unofficial memorial, with occasional flowers placed on its banks, reminders of a life cut short. Years passed, and the house continued to decay, sagging into the landscape like an unwanted relic. Rumors circulated that it was haunted by the spirits of the dead, but in reality, the house's true ghosts were the memories it held, the echoes of Lily's laughter, the arguments between Nancy and Lily that had filled its halls, and the silent weight of Richard's grief. Occasionally, curious teenagers from the town would dare one another to sneak onto the property after dark, but most left quickly, unnerved by the sheer silence of the place. The woods, once inviting and full of life, now felt menacing, as if they, too, had absorbed the violence that occurred within their depths. The house became part of local folklore, a place no one could forget but no one dared to approach. And so it stood, empty and untouched, a symbol of the fragility of life and the dark undercurrents that had swept through Willow Creek. Richard Barnes, long removed from Willow Creek, never found peace. He spent his days in quiet isolation, far from the town that had once been his whole world. His guilt over Lily's death gnawed at him, an unrelenting force that kept him up at night, staring into the darkness of his small apartment, wondering how he had missed the signs. And the sheriff had tried to reassure him. There was no way you could have known, he had said, but Richard couldn't believe it. The signs had been there: Nancy's simmering resentment, her cold treatment of Lily, but he had chosen to ignore them, to believe that things would eventually settle. His blindness had cost his daughter her life, and no matter how many people told him otherwise, the guilt was his alone to bear. He tried, at times, to make sense of it all. He replayed the memories over and over, wondering if there had been a single moment where he could have stopped it. Would he have noticed something in Nancy's demeanor? Could he have intervened before the tension boiled over into murder? These thoughts haunted him endlessly, leaving him a hollowed-out version of the man he had once been. Richard had stopped visiting Lily's grave. It wasn't because he had forgotten her; on the contrary, her memory followed him everywhere. But every time he stood at her graveside, the crushing weight of his failure became unbearable. Instead, he carried her with him in his heart, every day like a heavy stone he could never set down. Life moved on around him, but for Richard, time had stopped the day they found Lily's body in the woods. He became a ghost of himself, disconnected from the world, existing in a liminal space between the past and the present. He stopped answering calls from his old friends, stopped visiting the diner where he had once been a familiar face. His world had shrunk to the size of his grief, and he saw no way out. Nancy's trial and conviction had brought some closure to the town, but for Richard, it had only deepened the wound. Knowing what she had done, hearing her cold recounting of Lily's final moments, had solidified the truth that he had failed as a father. No punishment Nancy received could ever change that. In the end, Richard Barnes lived the rest of his life as a man haunted not just by the death of his daughter, but by the realization that he had let the monster into their home. His love for Nancy had blinded him to the growing danger, and now he would live with that knowledge until his own days came to an end. And when they did, there would be no one left to remember the Barnes family except the quiet town of Willow Creek and the empty farmhouse where it had all fallen apart.